Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of my fall series, Into the Woods, where I'm interviewing traditional and folkloric witches of all sorts of varieties. And today I'm very, very, very pleased to have Matt Auryn on the show. Matt, hello.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going amazing. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Now, I suspect most people watching this will know who you are, but for those people who may be new to the scene or who may not have come across your work before, a little introduction. So Matt Auryn is a witch, retired professional psychic, and occult teacher. He is also the multi-award-winning author of the international best-selling books Psychic Witch and Mastering Magick. He is a high priest in the Sacred Fires tradition of witchcraft. Starting out as a renowned psychic reader in the Salem, Massachusetts area, Matt now resides on the West Coast. A much sought-after speaker, he has been featured in various magazines, radio shows, podcasts, books, anthologies, and other periodicals. Matt previously contributed to Patheos Pagan with his column for Puck Saves and currently teaches at Modern Witch University. So to find out more about him and his work, and I'll put these details down below, you can visit his website, mattauryn.com. or follow him on Instagram at Matt Auryn. So again, welcome to the show, Matt. Thank you for meeting with me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I've been waiting for this all day. So it's kind of like we were saying earlier in the chat, like meeting people in person is a very different experience, but also being able to like chat with someone on video that like known online, but haven't gotten to like interact vocally and visually. So I'm really happy to be on and be able to chat with you today.
I have to be honest, I'm a little nervous because I'm not fanboying over you, but I've looked up to you for a very long time. And about 15 minutes before we started recording, I got a message from Devin, and he invited me onto his podcast. And I said, oh, well, I'm going to have to wait to, get back to your message because I'm getting ready to interview Matt. He was like, oh, you're interviewing Matt? Oh, he's so excited. So you're the one he's talking to today. I was like, so but it was good, and we talked a little bit about that before. So Matt, I mean, we're obviously recording this in the summertime, but this is going to be coming out around Halloween time. So I guess my first question then is kind of, what does it feel like to be now an author of two best-selling books? What is that feeling like?
It's a mixed bag. For the most part, it's great. I'm happy that my books are doing well, that I can support myself focusing on what I want to do. But most of all, that like people are resonating with it, that people are loving it, and getting feedback from people about how it's changed their practice or their lives has been like, that's like the best thing I could ever possibly hear. So, all of that has been great. There was a period where I was really burnt out after Psychic Witch, because everyone wanted me on their podcast, everyone wanted me to do events, and I was like, yes, 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 yes to everything, and then just kind of like, when I went to start writing Mastering Magick, I was like, I just need to stop. I need to take a break and, focus on what I'm doing now. And since then, I've kind of refigured out my pace for things, and am not hitting everything so hard and intensely. And most of all, I've tapped back into a passion that like I've been looking for, which was the passion I had when I wrote Psychic Witch. That Mastering Magick, while I love it, I'm very proud of it and I put a lot into it. That was written at a very odd time, just in terms of history of our country and our world and my personal life. Is during the pandemic. There was a lot of things going on in the world, and then I caught COVID, and I had to write a book with COVID to like reach my deadline. And so while I was really proud of it and I still love the book a lot, I essentially felt even more burnt out after writing that one. But the new book I'm working on right now, like, is my favorite. I'm totally pouring everything I've got into it, and it feels good to have that again. Because a lot of it too was mastering magic. There was just so much pressure to follow up Psychic Witch that it was very crippling. So, I kept thinking about, like, different reviewers and different people's, like, negativity, or even one of the questions I kept getting asked on podcasts constantly was like, well, how are you going to follow this up? How are you going to do something as good or better? So I've kind of totally now released all of that. Like, I really don't give a shit, and I just want to write the books that I want to write, that, like, I would have loved having growing up, or just even in my practice, moving forward. So book 3 so far is my favorite, and I'm really excited about it. But enough about books.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about books, because I mean, all of the updates that you've posted on, it seems like the energy is there. It reminds me of how you were speaking about, and yeah, I was a little Facebook stalking you back when you were Psychic Witch was coming out. But it reminds me of that energy back then. It almost feels like this new book that you're working on is like a first book again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost like, I don't know, it's better because I've grown as an author, and I've also, like, I feel like I've taken the best parts of the first 2 books and have figured out, like, exactly the flow I want, like what I think will be most helpful for people. And while I don't want to discuss what the book's about, because I'm still,
Of course.
manifesting it into reality, um, I I really feel like this fills a much needed gap. Just like I felt like Psychic Witch did. So I'm very excited. I was talking to, well, I guess not talking, I was typing. Teresa Reed, the tarot lady. I don't know if you're familiar with her or not. She's amazing. She interviewed me for, like, a thing she has, like, it's like a subscription thing, like, where she interviews authors about their writing process. And I was discussing a lot of what I personally discovered, which was, about, because one of the questions was, how long does it take you to write a book? And
That's a good question.
the answer is both years and, like, a month.
Yeah.
So, like, it's almost like it's like pregnancy. And I hate to use that metaphor, but my editor uses it, and I can't think of a better metaphor, because it's like it just gestates, right? But I have to be in that flow, and once I'm in that flow, I bust the book out. That's how it was with my previous 2 books. But in the formulation of it, there's a lot of, like, just kind of like visioning, I guess, of what it is. And then in the case of mastering magic, there's a lot of experimental magic I had to do and make sure that it worked before, I put it into a book. Particularly, the exercises that I can't tell, like the ones for neurodivergent people with ADHD or aphantasia. I had to formulate a bunch of stuff, get people that I know that are diagnosed with that, friends of mine who are practitioners, and be like, try these, see what works, and a lot of them didn't work, but what did work is what ended up making it into the book. So, like, a lot of that takes a long time, but essentially, like, you get into what I would call, well, science would call the alpha brainwave state, but, like, a lot of writers or artists or dancers would refer to it as the flow state. You tap into something, you tap into that, like the Romans would call it your genius, right? Like, then something just kind of flows through you and it just comes out. And then I have editors to make sure it's not a hot mess.
Right. Thank God for the editors, right?
Yes.
They're amazing. There's a lot of pressure, though, when you're first starting to write a first draft of getting at least I felt this way, of getting everything right, without realizing that the editors are there to really, help to rein you in and bring you. It's a process, right?
Yeah. Well, and especially, because I don't have like education on writing beyond, basic education. Like I didn't go to college. I don't, I never thought I would be a writer. And I ended up blogging, and the way that I blogged was pretty much how I talked. And then that kind of carried over in the books. So while that's great because it keeps like somewhat of a conversational tone, um, how you speak versus what is proper grammar is not the same
Very
thing at all.
different. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
very different.
luckily,
Yeah.
luckily I have editors that to me it's like a superpower. Like, because I even using like Grammarly and stuff like that, like it makes a lot of suggested changes that just like kill your tone or completely change what you're saying. So like I don't even use that anymore. Like I tried it and I was just like, you know, I don't
Yeah,
know.
it didn't work for you. Yeah.
They
Do you
pay
do you find
editors.
then? Yeah, I know, right? Well, something I found with mine was I have a very convoluted way of writing because I had to go through speech therapy and I had a Welsh speech therapist. And so my writing style is very like old Victorian flowery and it's way too much, right? So like my, sentences are just run on sentences. And I find I talk like that too. So when it comes to actually trying to translate to how have a presentable tone, it's different for me. It's fascinating listening to some of our colleagues um, with that dynamic of translating. You get people who just love to teach instead because they can have that more conversational tone. Do you find that for yourself?
Yes and no. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I'm a little bit more articulate with the written word. Because I can pause and like think about what I'm going to say. Whereas I'm a lot more rambly when I speak. But I definitely like, I'm English is my first language, but like I definitely have the similar thing where one of my learning experiences with now being on my well, I guess fourth book, because I did half of one with Evo. But one of the things I've realized is I can cut sentences into multiple sentences, because my sentences do trail on and they're like unnecessary. So I've learned the power of the period, um, and chopping that
It's a
up.
powerful thing. It's a powerful thing, the power of periods, right? And I love semicolons. Semicolons are my favorite thing. Ah. So so with that writing style of yours, you've grown as a writer, right? Coming out of the blogosphere and having that more comfortable tone. I know some writers, when they actually sit down, and I found this with my own writing too, when they actually sat down and became stronger writers because we're forced to write these 80 to 100,000 word pieces, did it start to impact how you thought on a regular basis, like even your thinking patterns?
I'm I'm not sure.
Hmm.
Can I guess maybe I don't understand your question fully.
Sorry, like in if you're after going through a writing stint,
Right.
after spending like 5 or 6 hours perhaps writing and being in that frame of mind, then going away and watching television or hanging out with the fiancés or boyfriends. In thinking, then even how you conceptualize how you're thinking, it's almost like language. If you speak a different language, if you force your brain to think differently, did you notice that was happening to you?
So yes and no, in some ways. So because my writing process is so like channely, like I was saying, like, it's in this gestation for a long time, and then it just like boom, once I got it. But during that gestation time, like my thinking totally changes. Like I end up having like particularly really weird abstract dreams where I'm just like contemplating concepts and like trying to explain, like figure out how to explain things that may be a little bit more complicated or advanced, and figure out
Mm.
like, well, how can I simplify that? How can I, um, you know, tie it to other things, stuff like that. So that's what I mean, like that, like a lot of
Mm.
the length of writing the book is more it's more of a conceptualization than the actual physical writing. When I go to sit down to actually physically write, it's like a month or two.
Mm.
But usually by then my thinking's just kind of like back to normal.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. That makes me curious then, because you were talking a little while ago about coming back to a sense of spiritual practice and again after being in conceptual mode. What did you notice about how your spirituality and how your magic changed after focusing so much on creating books?
Yeah, so this is something that I don't think a lot of people realize who don't do it. But once you make your work, your spiritual practice, your magical practice, it shifts things completely. Particularly because A, it's a time suck. And then B, it's like you're talking about it and you're dealing with it so much that you have to find, at least for me, my perspective is you have to find that passion again, because it feels like work, and like going to your altar, going to your spiritual practice shouldn't feel like work. In my opinion, it should be a refuge. It should be something that fills your cup and doesn't empty it. So a lot has had to change with like my relationship with my magical practice and my spiritual practice. And part of that is also like, my woo magical beliefs of like true will. And I do believe that like this work is part of my true will. So there's an acknowledgement that like even when I'm taking time away from like what my normal practice might look like when I'm not writing, it's still part of the work of the great work. So at least that's something that I tell myself to feel better. you know um but yeah, I think it's also, so one thing that was really interesting around the time of Psychic Witch was when I would go to group rituals or I would go to a party or whatever, like people would come up to me and they'd either start talking about my work, or if it was someone new, they'd start small chat with like, so what do you do for work? And I just like, I didn't want to talk about it because it's like my job is to literally talk about it all the time,
Right.
and like I don't want to seem like an asshole either, and to be like, I don't want to talk about this. But I think it's very similar with spiritual practice of like trying to learn the balance of what your work is versus what your spiritual practice is, and the balance in that. And a lot of that I think is also about finding that passion again and finding that excitement. And it's something that like a lot of people have talked about, like Thorne Mooney talks a lot about like burnout. Courtney Weber has. It's a very real thing in the field that we do.
I've noticed in just chatting in private with our colleagues, a lot of times, and I didn't realize this for myself until I got closer to, I mean, by the time this gets out, my book will be out, but I'm just a month from my book coming out. And
Oh, your
I
book's not out
noticed
yet?
it's not out yet. I know, it's like, why?
Yeah, I know the
I'm
feeling.
ready for it to be like, go off to college and just, fuck off, right? But
It's great though. I'm very
thank
excited to
you.
see how people respond to it.
I am
So
too. And thank you for doing that beautiful review for me. That was really, 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 not only was it ego inducing, thank you, but it was also, it was a nice boost. I like to have somebody who not only has gone through this before, but so successfully too. It was such a beautiful thing. But
that's
it's,
very sweet to say. I said that's very sweet to say. I wouldn't do that if it wasn't good work. I don't endorse things that I'm like, eh. But I know for me with Psychic Witch, I got so many endorsements from people I respected because it was sort of my vaccination, because I knew that there was going to be people that didn't like it and that hated it, and so like if someone who's like dabbling in like witchcraft that doesn't know what they're talking about, it's like a faceless reviewer is talking crap about it, but I have Maxine Sanders over here saying it's a priceless jewel, like
Right.
it doesn't weigh the same. So
It's funny you said that because I feel the same way. When I started to reach out to people, like I got Ronald Hutton to give me a review. That was like Ronald Hutton,
right,
Um,
right.
and I felt much the same way. Like I haven't received any negative reviews, but I'm anticipating that. Because the reality is that not everybody's going to like your work. Not everybody's going to understand your work. Not everybody's going to necessarily get it, right? But what I found interesting, well, what you were saying just before about finding that passion again for your work, what I've noticed in me, and I'd like to hear from you about this, is I've noticed that with my own private spirituality, it's become even more private. Yes, there's this forward facing version of ancestor work. Yes, there's this magic that I put forward, but with my own stuff, it really is more me. And I'm very much more protective of that. Did you find that for you as well?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of things that I'll never talk about. And like, so before this was my work, I was a lot more open of talking of like, oh, I had this spiritual experience, or I had this psychic experience, or whatever, and talking about it openly. But now it just feels so. Jason Miller once said something on some podcast or something. I don't remember. I just know he said it somewhere, where he talks about like that he's had experiences that he'll never share because A, most people wouldn't believe them, and B, you shouldn't believe it just because someone has said it,
Makes sense.
and I definitely feel that. But yeah, I mean, there's for the most part, like what I teach is absolutely exactly what I do. It's just that then there's so much more, that's kept for me in my spiritual practice, because spirituality, like I'm a very firm believer that it should be personal, and it should be about how your spirit relates to everything else, how it connects to the world of spirit and magic and deity. um, and I think that's personal, and it doesn't apply to everyone.
Totally agree. I totally agree. I think there can be a tendency to, and this is where the ego thing comes in, be a tendency to want to be acknowledged and recognized, especially as moving into this capitalistic sort of sphere of becoming a writer or becoming a name, right? Um, I think that it's almost that authenticity piece, and meanwhile, the authenticity is already there. Doing the things in private and secret and personal connection is more authentic than necessarily people saying, "Oh yeah, you had this experience." Oh yes, yes.
Well, and I think that our generation, I can't say generation because it's not an age thing, but our wave of authors in this work, which is sort of a generation. um I think we're in a very strange position because
Mhm.
we have never had so many people that want to be witchcraft influencers who may not necessarily have the experience and knowledge and background to be leading people and teaching people. And then those people are getting book deals and getting, a lot of attention and stuff. And I don't think that's inherently like wrong or bad, like to each their own. But, there is definitely something to be said about, like people who this genuinely is their spirituality and has been, and for the most part, I think people have good intentions, but the idea of a witchcraft influencer grosses me out to no end. It, and I don't mean that to sound condescending or whatever. I think it's a matter of motives, and where your motives are with things. Um, you know, I do, and people like you and a lot of people in our field, what we do is passion based. It's passion based because it excites us and it's what we geek out on. But also, most of us have a genuine desire to want to help people and teach people and be like, oh, look what works for me, or like, oh, I do it this way. As opposed to like, just being like, oh, I hope, I get 1 million followers so people start wanting to pay me for things. I yeah.
Yeah, I know you've been around in the community. I think as long as me, 20 years you've been around in the community, haven't you?
I
Even
really
longer,
don't
maybe.
know.
The years have just flown by. Well, I was chatting to somebody I randomly, we apparently used to know each other 20 years ago on Pagan Space. I mean, going back into the early days of the internet there, and just remembering what it was like back then when we didn't have these influencers, or we didn't have really badly made documentaries on television. What it was like back then, there seemed to be a lot more of a soul. I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know.
but also like I think there's been benefits to our
Right.
generation of writers and even the ones right before us, in the fact that like we've helped to kind of unhomogenize witchcraft, because with the internet and with being able to like get so much information and exchange ideas and be like, oh, I didn't know about that tradition of witchcraft, I want to go train in that, or this occult order, we're able to bring more to the table and more perspective, so everything isn't um this sort of like watered down version of Wicca, which isn't bashing Wicca as the British traditional, but like everyone knows what I mean when I talk about like the watered down version of Wicca. Um, so I mean, I think it's Christopher Penczak often references the era we're in as being the great blessing and the great curse, because we have
Mm,
access to all this wealth of information, but the curse is that we have access to all this wealth of information that like it's overwhelming. We don't know, what is legit and what isn't, what's founded, what's unfounded. Um, and yeah, that
it's
just
true.
resonates.
No, it's true. It's very true. I feel like we're on a verge, though, because, and I know you've spoken a great deal about it, as many of our colleagues have, about the rise of AI, the rise of these horrifically bad books on Amazon, for example, by like, I'm not going to say their name, but um, what I've noticed though is that those, I don't want to say more serious people, but for those people who they have that grounded sense of, okay, something's not right here. There seems to be a swing back. Of course, the theme of my podcast this fall is all about traditional and folkloric witchcraft. There seems to be a swing back to wanting that connection.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, I mean, premonitions here. Where do you think that will go?
Well, I think that the
Mhm.
AI thing is not going to be that prominent in the witchcraft genre. I think it is right now because of the rise of seekers and dabblers at the moment. But I've been around long enough that I know that this comes in waves, and I know exactly how this is going to work out. Eventually, like witchcraft won't be such a something that's mentioned in like Cosmopolitan and stuff like that, like mainstream. It'll just be something of like, oh, I tried that once. And I think a lot of the AI books are marketed towards dabblers and seekers that are like, oh, there's an Amazon book that's 99 cents or Kindle Unlimited. um, and I think once the people producing those books realize that they're not making money, they're just going to switch to a different focus. Um, but yeah, AI fascinates me on lots of levels. It terrifies me on other levels. Um, I think I think it'll be really interesting to see where we go with it in general. Because there's some aspects of it that are just like completely terrifying, including conversations with AI, you know.
That's always, I have a transhumanist coming on at some point in the near future, and I'm curious to speak to him about that because I know that in like egregore circles and like chaos magic circles and whatnot, there's a real interest in connecting with the ghost in the machine, right? I'm like that. Like, is there something in there? Isn't there something in there? Right? It makes me wonder, you know.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a fan of that idea. You know, I'm a huge proponent of free will and bodily and not autonomy and all of that. But I personally will not be merging my consciousness with AI. Just because I don't know, like technology is weird and we know how hackable it is and how there's just a lot of things that you know, I don't know. I'm just like, go meditate, go connect with the spirits, you know, like you don't need that. But like to each their own. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if that's what they want, you know, like I'm not against them doing that, but personally, the idea I don't want to be a Borg, you know.
Me either. Me either. No, that's not something. No, that doesn't feel good to me. No, it'll be interesting because I feel like that swing. There seems to be a swing back to tradition in the world, at least in the Western world. And it seems to be younger people too. I've seen a lot of, especially for folkloric witchcraft folk, a lot more interest amongst like 20 something,
Mhm.
30 somethings. It's very, very interesting to watch. Speaking about spirits, I have a question for you around your move. So, for a long time, you were in Salem, Massachusetts. You're originally from California, and now you're back in California. I'm curious. We were just speaking just before we started recording about the differences in spirit. A lot of my work is around landscape and spirit.
Yeah,
I certainly noticed a difference between Ontario and the UK. What was it like
I
for you to
imagine.
move back, and what was that like for you?
Yeah. Yeah, so the immediate thing that I notice is the difference of landscape spirits, or land spirits. Even though I'm right by the forests are so different. Like because I'm over here by the redwoods, whereas New England is, I don't know if there's a name for it. It's New England forests. Um, but there's like the spirits are different because the way the energies of the way the trees seem to be working with energy feels different. So New England feels very much, in my experience, like the trees are pulling down into the underworld, and so there's this really strong like underworld type energy to New England, whereas over here in the redwoods it feels like the opposite. It feels like reaching up to like the upper world, you know. So it's not like one's better or worse, but it's definitely very different. And when the ecology, the spiritual, well, the physical and the spiritual ecology is so vastly different like that, like it changes everything, like the nature of spirits. I think the biggest trip in terms of this for me was actually visiting New Orleans for the first time. Because you know, I am not a voodoo initiate. I do not practice ATRs. And I didn't think much of it, but going to New Orleans, I was like baffled because I was like, I don't know what any of these spirits are. Like there's so many spirits around me that I couldn't even classify it because I don't have a frame of reference. It's sort of like if you lived in England your whole life and then suddenly you're transported to Australia that has completely unique animals. You're going to be like, what is that giant jumping rat, you know? And so I think New Orleans is like the biggest trip for me. It's cool. I love it. Um,
When
but
was that? When did you go to New Orleans for the first time? Was that recently or
like I think like 4 or 5 years ago.
5 years ago? Yeah.
So, I mean, not super recently, but fairly recently. Yeah. Um, that that was really interesting. We went on a tour with Christopher Penzak's Temple of Witchcraft. So it was like one of those things, which was cool because then we got like sort of more of a spiritual tour, and we got like tour guides that like were practitioners and of the local practices and stuff. And one of the coolest things, I mean, I don't know, cool for me as like a psychic witch, is we were brought into a building late at night, and we were told just to go through the house and like not, I guess it was kind of more of a condo type thing, but go through it and just kind of see what we pick up, you know. And so like everyone was going off into rooms and like, oh, this doll's creepy and stuff, which it's totally creepy. But I went back to the tour guide, and she's like, oh, do you feel anything? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, for some reason, I get the worst feeling in the kitchen. And the kitchen, the way it was set up was very like transitional, you know. So it's just something we're just kind of moving through, as opposed to like anyone really like kind of focusing in there. But I also picked that up as a psychic, that no one was actually exploring the kitchen, almost like, you know, subconsciously on an energetic level they weren't. And so she was like, oh, well, like, you know, go with it, like, what do you feel? And I'm like, well, you know, for some reason I really don't like the fridge, um but you know, other than that, I can't really place it right now, because it was also psychically noisy with everyone in the house, you know, the
Imagine.
whole group. But it turned out that like after the huge New Orleans flood, that a couple that lived there, the man, like, I guess, went nuts, and he killed his wife and or girlfriend, and like chopped her up and like baked her, and then like kept it in his fridge. And it was there until his arrest, and that's where they discovered it. So like,
Hmm.
for me, like, I love that kind of shit because I'm like, validation,
Yeah, yeah,
verification,
yeah.
you know. But it's still a horrible thing to have to like pick up on. But I love doing that sort of stuff. I love going out to places and, you know, just blindly trying to pick up on like, well, what happened here, you know, like, are they spirits, what kind of spirits are they? We very rarely as a household do house calls unless we're a last resort.
Mm.
And we did one recently where this wealthier man, it was for a wealthier man, and he had called in all sorts of shamans from around the world, and he was just pouring thousands and thousands of dollars into this because, you know, of the ghosts in the house, and he couldn't sell the land. So like, he had a giant vineyard, and so like, me, Devin, and Storm all remote viewed to see what it was, and we all came to the same conclusion. But we're like, okay, well, like, let's go and see what it is. And it wasn't ghosts at all. It was the land spirits. You know,
Oh,
the land
interesting.
spirits wouldn't let the house be sold, and they were upset because they weren't getting anything out of all of this like great
Mm.
production. And the guy, like, he was like, oh my God, it's like the most obvious thing I didn't think of. He's like, I'll give an offering and talk to like a flower if I pick it on the land. But then when it comes to my grapes, I just, like, you know, I don't even think about it.
Right.
And so like, we set them up to like get that all worked out, and, you know, so that they could get a relationship. And we told him how to work with the land spirit to try to sell the house. And I went through and I like cleansed the house and like secured it and all that stuff. And I love doing that stuff. I love going in and like just using my like woo psychic powers to pick things up. Which is why I'm really excited about Michelle Belanger's new paranormal thing
It's
she's
looking
got
really
going.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, because they are legit. Like, because they've been on those TV shows, and I know that they have literally walked away from those TV shows because of like fluffing things up, or like, you know, so like their integrity is really, really strong with that. And and not only that, the approach. So like a lot of those ghost hunter type shows are just so disrespectful to the spirits.
Terrible. Yeah.
And they, if you watch, they constantly make pacts and then break them immediately. They're like,
Mhm.
give us a sign, make a noise, and we'll leave. And then it happens. And then so they're like, not leaving.
It's yeah, I grew up on all of those as well. And I mean, in retrospect, half of them were more than half of them. It's that sensationalizing of it, right? You would never ever treat a spirit like that in their own spaces if you actually gave a shit for what you were doing, right?
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
it's just, it comes, a lot of it is very much influenced by the Warrens and their approach. And like, I know a lot of people put them on a pedestal, but I don't. I think that they are like a main reason that like everyone goes into these things thinking anything that happens in their house, it's a demon. And like, you need to like get aggressive with it and get it out. And, I don't know. That's
So
not how I
it
work with the spirit world.
Absolutely. No, I feel the same way. When we were in the UK, we lived in a cottage that was like 500 years old. Like parts of the house was 500 years old. When my parents moved over to Canada, they bought a 170-year-old stone old brewery. And we fully well knew that the old owner was still in there. Same with some of his family and all of that, right? And you just got on with it. You could feel that when my parents started putting the business back together, they started a brewery in an old brewery building, right? You could feel that there was a hand guiding there. It was something, it felt comfortable, right? But I mean, that's the thing. I feel like maybe a North American thing. I hesitate to say that because I'm sure there are Europeans who also are equally disrespectful. But I wonder if being in such a new place relatively affects and impacts as well as, of course, what the Warrens were doing, right? I'm curious, but
Yeah, I mean, like, I think just as a people, our relationship with this land is very different, because we came in as colonizers. We came in with, just a very like conquering, this is our land type thing. And, whether, obviously we personally did not do that as individuals, but for a lot of us, um, those are our ancestors who did that, so there's still that. See, now I'm getting into your area,
it
you
always
know
happens.
but like that is an ancestral issue. It's baggage that displays itself in our interaction with the land and people and spirits. And I think that's why the Warrens approach just kind of like
Mm,
resonated with people, especially because we have a history of wanting to villainize the other in America, whether it's the Salem witch trials or it's how we depicted and treated Native Americans or slaves. Like we have, it's a very gross, aggressive, dominating type energy. So I think definitely there's a difference, as opposed to I'm just speculating here, but I feel like Europe, even when it's Christianized, they still have a history of the people interacting with the land and the land spirits. And, it took some transition. Whereas coming to America, it was all about a fresh start, like we're cleansing the slate. A lot of people, hid their ethnic background and changed their last names to seem, more less Italian or less Irish or less whatever, so yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of dysfunction related to disconnect and wanting to like dominate things in North America.
I completely agree. I completely agree. Having grown up over here and feeling that, even in Canada, I mean, people have this conception that Canada is this wonderfully polite, beautiful country that has no problems, but it's equally as effed up the United States is,
Yeah.
right? Um, that feeling of domination. It's interesting coming then people who are coming into our traditions and into kind of a witchcraft community. from a place of religious trauma because they themselves are victimized, bringing that sense of entitlement as well. And I mean, I feel you might not feel comfortable saying it, but I will. There's a big issue with that, with people coming in and demanding that spirits work with them, and power over magic, over and dominating, right? You,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of baggage there. When you come from any religion to another religion, especially, and I'm using the word religion loosely to describe magical practices.
Mm-hmm.
But there we're less dogmatic. We're less telling people like what is the truth. We're more like, here's what we do, like find your truth kind of a thing. And I think a lot of people definitely carry not just how they interact with spirits, like you're saying, but also how they even view the spirits of the religion that they came from.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of animosity towards those spirits or those egregores, because I think it's a mix of both. Because you got people working with spirits, people coming together is gonna create an egregore.
Yeah, it's going to create that. That actually is a nice little soiree into or transition point into something else I was really curious about.
Okay.
You and Matt and Devin are very vocal about your relationship with each other, and you just spoke about going and working with each other in a spiritual sense. I feel like a lot of people have this image out there of coming into the community, and especially gay males noticed they're looking for not only partnership in a sexual romantic sense but also partnership in a practice sense too. What was it like for you in your practice when you started practicing with your partners, and what has that process been like for you, if you're comfortable talking about that, of course?
Yeah. So not a lot changed, honestly. Like, I mean, like we do stuff together, but it's not as often as people think. Like, we each are sort of, and it's the most witchcraftiest thing ever. We're each sort of kings of our own domain. And when I say domain, I mean like we all have sort of our own like cosmos around us of spirits we work with and magic. What I find particularly fascinating is how different all of our like energetic signatures are, where you can almost like tell who did what, or like what spirit like is working with who or drawn to who, just because it's very different. Chaz is a lot more, even though he's a fairy initiate, they all are. He's a lot more into the folk magic and that aspect of it. And then, Storm is all about like the ecstatic fairy energy. And then me and Devin are probably the closest in energy signature, but we're still very, very, very different. Yeah, I think there's pros and cons about getting with someone that is a magical practitioner. There's obviously the pros of like, I mean, it's hard being with someone who doesn't understand or respect or believe in what you do. That's difficult for sure. But then it's also difficult because we're very opinionated bunches of switches, by nature,
True.
so but for the most part, it's great, it's beautiful, I love it. It's also, I think the best part is watching when we do come together to do magic, like all those different sort of I don't know a better word than kingdoms, those kingdoms coming together and like uniting into something very palpable.
Mm.
Yeah. So when I say kingdom, I just kind of sort of mean like our own relationship to our inner realms,
Mhm.
to the inner planes, as well as like our relationship to magic and the spirits we work with. So that's what I mean by kingdom, because I kind of see it just sort of as like, this sort of like
Like the domain, right? Yeah.
this domain that we work in. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure what to ask you now, to be honest. That was quite an answer. I love that. Well, I mean, like following you on Facebook, following you on social media, like you share a lot about your private life on there, of course. I keep chuckling. I don't know why I keep remembering it, but I keep chuckling about Storm messaging you or Devin to pick up. But like it's just so mundane stuff, but it's kind of I feel like a lot of people coming in, especially queers, especially LGBT folk, coming into these traditions, again, coming from that place of hurt, coming from that place of trauma. I've noticed there seems to be a kind of current transitionary period where it's suddenly trying to be all the things, trying to be this, badass witch, trying to be taking on a persona that's not authentic, right? And then slowly getting into self again, right?
Well,
And I know you talk about that in Psychic Witch. Sorry, go on.
I think there's like, two main things too, is that like I think a lot of people come to witchcraft and magical practices, not everyone, but a lot of people, to escape, and they treat it as a form of escapism, and they like let it completely absorb their identity and their world. And I am immersed in witchcraft so much in my life, but it's also like it doesn't control my life. I it's integrated into my life, and that's what takes a lot of that sort of work and practice, is integrating it into a normal mundane life. The other thing that I see, and I think that this is something that just kind of happens with growth too naturally, is this sort of desire to want to argue with people and to correct people and to tell people what to do. And I think that again comes from these mainstream religions that we're coming from, and the baggage of that, you know. And like we all do it on some level, but I've gotten much better at just being like, oh, this person's wrong, and like just scrolling, like I have no problem with them being wrong, or like having it be something that like that's not my experience or understanding, but I think like particularly the Christian faiths are very big on because Christianity was sort of the banner that was used for a lot of this dominance of America. So, there is a lot of like, you're doing it the wrong way, this is the right way. Oh, this is the truth sort of thing, and I think reality, especially the non-physical aspects of it, are a lot more malleable than that background kind of makes it out to be.
I agree. I agree. It's that movement from that dogmatic place, from that insecure place to a secure place where things can be
Right.
so malleable. Absolutely. I've in Psychic Witch and in Mastering Magic, you make that point often. You make that point about experiential and experimental, and really coming back into relationship. While I was writing my own book, that word relationship kept again and again. And when I actually started to really connect with it a lot more, I could see it in other colleagues' work.
Yeah.
What does that word relationship mean to you? The way you want to put it?
That's a really good question.
I have to get one good question in here.
So I mean, I guess it's hard to. I feel like one of those like really shitty dictionaries where you're like, well, you use the word to define the word that you're defining, So for me, it's how you relate to other things. So it's about can I break that down into a better word than relate? So it's about your your relationship with everything else. So I guess it's where you fit in the narrative of everything around you, both physically and non-physically, and what that connection of give and take and relationship is. It's so hard to talk about it without using that word. Does that make sense? Or do I
Does
need
make
to
sense.
like
It makes
try
sense
to
to me.
clarify that better? I mean, it's so hard to use it without the word relate or relationship. So it's like I have, and it's going to be different. Like I have a different relationship with you than I do my mother, and I
Oh,
have
yes.
a different relationship with my dog than I do, a spiritual teacher. I have a different relationship with all of my partners, and they all have different relationships with each other. So it's really about like a unique connection and understanding what that connection is and what your role is in that connection, which is going to be not a one size fits all sort of thing. Just like in terms of our relationship, like while our relationships are all equal, they're all different because it's different people involved in the dynamics.
Mhm. I love that answer. I really do. It ties really well into what you were just saying about malleability, about not coming with that one size fits all. And again, you make that point again and again in your work about not bringing in one size fits all, finding that relationship,
Yeah.
what you're
Well,
working
and
with, whether it be.
I,
Hmm?
I think that's one of the keys to magic, though, is
Mhm.
this idea of being able to hold paradox. And you can't hold paradox if your mind is rigid and it's set on, this is the thing, because then how alchemically are you going to bring the opposite in as an equal truth at the same time? So like I think I say in the book that like paradox is at the heart of witchcraft, and I really believe that that's true. And for that you need to have a very flexible, open mind.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Think that where it becomes difficult is we're, small-minded individual three-dimensional creatures trying to conceptualize like 20-dimensional reality, right?
Right. Well, and then even then, like in my perspective, like this part of us is like the least important part. So like I just was chatting with a friend who shared an article which was about the endless debate that you get in Western occultism, which I'm a part of. So like I'm super into these topics, but it's about the holy guardian angel. And is the holy
Mhm.
guardian angel an aspect of yourself, like your higher self, or is it an external entity? And one of the things I was saying was, that's no longer how I ask that question. The way that I view it now is, am I a part of the holy guardian angel? Not, is the holy guardian
Mhm.
angel a part of myself? Because our middle self, our ego, our I am Matt, person, we want to make everything referencing the self. We want everything to be with how it relates to self. And I think, particularly when you get into like the more kind of transcendental beliefs, as well as even animism, you start realizing that like you're important, but you're not that important. I think I see our personality as just sort of a tool that we use while we're incarnated. I think when we're not incarnated, our consciousness isn't as um, distinct as we are. And I think like like working with ancestors is a great example. In my personal experience, when you work with the ancestors, there's a fluidity to them where they start blending into like what I call like the river of ancestors, the river of blood. um so like even that is like, you know, because that there's still some of that retained, particularly while there's still people alive who knew the individual, but that starts becoming less individual, I guess is the word, as
What's
time goes
relevant?
on. Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. And you know, I in my personal cosmology, you know, it's that river of blood, the ancestors, that comes again to create a new life with a higher self and a personality, you know. So it's this constant sort of like um merging and forming and then like separating, and you know, but I'm also really big on the mighty dead perspective of apotheosis, and
Hmm.
sort of, you know, and I know that gets into really woo like Western Victorian stuff, but you know, I do believe that there is something really fascinating about the concept of like, well, how do you crystallize that? Like how do you crystallize the personality with, you know, the
Hmm.
aspect of you that is ancestor and the aspect of you that is higher and divine. Um,
It's an interesting question because I think it touches on something that is at the core of why people fear death so much, and why people particularly fear like the waning parts of the year so much, is that loss of self, that loss of this ego form that we think we have and might be but might not be, blah blah blah, right? And that idea of apotheosis gives hope that will continue in a form that we can understand now. It's that relationship, right?
yeah, and um, you know, and I think even that isn't permanent. You know, I do believe all things come from the goddess, and all things will return to the goddess. You know, and you could change goddess for whatever your big concept of source deity is, or divinity. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those, again, it's a paradox, right? Because like if you look at the traditions of where, even outside of witchcraft, where people achieve this. So you look at bodhisattvas and you think of saints and stuff, a lot of it has to deal with the destruction of their ego and them doing it for a selfless reason for other people to be able to reach, you know, a certain state. Um, so I don't know. Like I'm very big on also like all of these things are sort of maps, they're ideas, they're models, you know. I don't think anyone fully has it figured out. I think our egos, our intellect likes these things, and they're helpful, but um
The pathways to something else. The,
yeah,
the
and
light of a shadow on the wall.
yeah, and I also think that, like, you know, this is why meditation is so important as well, of understanding, you know, what, or even in Crowley's work, you know, there's the crossing of the abyss, and, you know, the Night of Pan, and this sort of, you know, I guess in yoga you would call it like samadhi, but this idea of like eventually just sort of like dissolving the personality, or realizing that this thing is not real and what is real is beyond that. And I think, you know, the ego, like you were saying, wants to hold on to this personality and this sense of self. Um, but the experience of individuals who have experienced ego death and transcendental states is that, oh no, like that's where I want to be, like that's so much better than this.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing because it comes again back to that experiential. People get so caught up here, and
Right.
and when you actually experience something, whatever it is, whether it be a perfect moment or just getting lost in whatever that is, that fear dissolves because fear is up here, right?
Yeah, well, and then even then you can't, even experience isn't, like it's not universal enough. Like
Mm.
just because I have an experience doesn't mean that even that is truth, you know. And I think that's why I really love the concept of like the mysteries in witchcraft with the capital M, you know, these experiential things that you just have to experience and, you know, have your own gnosis about, that can't be explained. It can't be put into words, not because, you know, we're hiding something from people. It's just, you can't explain it. And I think that's different for different people. Because it goes back again, we're different spirits, and as different spirits, we have different relationships for things, and maybe even different reasons for incarnating. But yeah, I don't know. I'm going on a ramble.
No. This all ties into what we were talking about before. I think that what you just said really ties back into what we were saying about that move from look at me, look at my witchcraft, look at my experiences to, no, you know what? I can't translate what I just experienced into words. Or this is bigger than words.
Yeah, I actually look forward to the day that I can be a hermit, and like, you know, it's people don't believe this about me when they don't know me outside of the realm of witchcraft, but I'm extremely introverted. And I think a lot of our peers are too. I'm a very introverted person. You know, I don't like attention. I don't like the spotlight on me, but I also understand that the work that I have to do, and I mean work in the sense of my woo beliefs of this being my true will, my great work, it involves me having to do that and step out of my comfort zone, and even make other people uncomfortable with like being like, oh, Matt Auryn's promoting himself again, you know. But I'm not promoting myself, I'm promoting my work, and there's a distinction between that. And I often find it interesting because the people who usually make those comments are often people who promote themselves but have no work to promote to the world. So again, I think it's sort of a shadow thing. But if I could just be a hermit and do my work and let it get to the world and never have to need to interact with people, I'd be totally, totally happy about that. But that's not the nature of the world and the society that we're in. But
That's such a like a classic issue of the hermit, though, is that wanting to go off into the cave or wanting to go off into the forest, and then suddenly the village following you.
yeah. I I don't know. I and it's interesting because I watch people who are technically my peers, but that I see as like not my peers, you know, because they've been doing this for much longer, and I look up to them. And it's interesting because I see that they're getting to that point where it's like, okay, I'm ready to just disappear from the world, you know.
That's the torch.
Yeah, but I just, you know, I still feel like I have a lot more work to do. And you know, I love this work, and you know, for the most part, I love the people that I do get to interact with, and I love geeking out with people. I just, you know, I miss on some level just being that person that attends events, or just, you know, another covener, you know, and just, you know, not having that. I don't know.
Makes sense. Do you might sound like a very strange question, and people listening to this might seem a weird question, but do you find that you find community in that? Do you recognize that in others? Like Christoph Penzak, for example. I know through anecdotal evidence from mutual friends of ours that he has said or felt the same thing. Do you find that you connect more with people? Do you find your tribe through that feeling?
Um, yeah, yes and no. You know, I think, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, or anyone
Of
else's
course.
experience. But I I don't know. There's so in psychic, I'm gonna get woo again, but in psychic witch, I have this part where I talk about how like there's just this je ne sais quoi that you feel in someone, and a lot of it has to deal with their relationship to magic, and whether that is trained, or you know, a lot of us are kind of naturally drawn to it at an early age. You know, there's just something about them of like, you know, like they've worked with the same frequencies you have. They've connected with the earth, they've connected with the moon, they've connected with the spirits of the land, and so like, since we're a rarity in terms of the world itself, society at large, I often find the recognition in that. And I think that those sort of practices, when you genuinely are a practitioner, it lends you towards wanting to move off into, that kind of hermitage. As at least for me, it's just, my retirement dream of just like disappearing. Like I've contributed my work. Peace out, everyone.
It's time. It's time,
I
right?
know.
It's funny you mentioned that. I've witnessed that in a couple of people myself. That just it's right, and that letting go, that feeling of okay, I'm good now.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have to wait to that time, or do you find moments for yourself?
I mean, I try to find moments for myself. But in terms of like, I'm still young, as much as I want to joke about like, being an aging millennial, I'm young and I have, so much to learn and to teach and to share and connect with, other people, that like it's, although it's like an end goal dream, it's not something I'm actively striving for in the moment. I just, it's interesting. Like Devin makes fun of me because he's like, you're Britney, like, because I grew up with Britney Spears. That's our generation, right? And then she would have all these like sad songs no one would understand. That was like, oh, she's so lucky, she's a star, and you're like, really, you're crying about being, big. But like, I think attention, and fame, which I don't think I have, but like for our small pond, I am a known name. I think there's things that are permanently altered. Like, there's certain things I can't vent about, and I can't talk about openly. I cannot even retaliate to someone saying something against me the way that I could have before, because now it's punching down. So you just have to like smile and take the hits. So, but one of the best things that I got talking about reviews, which kind of brings us full circle to the very beginning, um, uh, because when you get positive reviews, it feels great. But it's those negative reviews that really stick with you, and you don't want them to. And I know that's why a lot of like the advice I got was to not look at reviews, don't look at reviews. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I think if that works for you, that's great. But it's because for some reason you can get like 200 positive reviews and then just one scathing review that just really gets you. And one of the best things I was told, and this was Jeff Cullen who actually told me this, he said, Matt, it's disrespectful to the readers that love your work to be dwelling on the people that hate it. And I was like, you're absolutely right, because it hinders what I'm doing in terms of work and feeling motivated and in the flow, So
that's really powerful. That makes total sense coming from Jeff too. I've seen some vitriolic things against him, and I've noticed he will only respond to those things that are just unfair, right?
Yeah. I don't know. Jeff has a very different approach to a lot of things. I love Jeff. But yeah, I think he's a lot more of a fighter than I am.
It's all choosing your battles, right?
Right.
I don't think people fully do realize that. I mean, that's a recurring thing. I have had so many of our colleagues warn me about that too, and don't look at that, don't look at them. And I suppose in some ways it's one of those, at least just speaking out us here, but in some ways it's that protecting yourself. But is it protecting yourself, right? Because you're just
Yeah.
insulated.
But I also want people's feedback,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm.
I it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be like, oh, hey, maybe I should look at like approaches for ADHD or
Mhm.
people who struggle with visualizing, because that's not something I've come across.
Mhm.
But it becomes such a consistent, and this was never done in kind of a negative way. But like I think feedback is helpful for us as writers, as well as teachers.
Yes.
Um, and I think shutting us off from that is not necessarily the healthiest thing to do, to become a better teacher. But I also, like, as I'm sure you've seen with other people, I see this with other people all the time, that like people take out their vendettas on reviews, and it's the most Karen thing in the world. And it's weird that there's a disconnect, that it's people don't see it as a Karen thing, but you're literally attacking someone's work, and trying to hurt it because you have an issue with them, or who knows what. So it's also about recognizing like who has a bone to pick versus what is actual legit criticism. Um,
That's huge. That is a huge piece. That's something that I came to realize in myself before I even started to write.
yeah,
Going through some parts of my own life and being very critical of fellow writers for no reason other than I was feeling insecure in my own life. And it's I see that a lot. I work as a therapist in my regular life, and that comes up a lot with that idea of that projection, right? Projection piece. But it's learning then to find the ones that we can trust will give us that solid, I'm
right.
giving you this feedback to make it better. That was my experience with our editors, right? Our shared editors are amazing in that way, but there needs to be a certain level of trust. What they're saying is actually to make us better than
Right.
pull us down, right?
Well, and you can quickly tell like who's actually read the book, and and like who's just talking, or you can also see like the the knowledge level of someone. Like I saw on TikTok, I try never to be on TikTok because that is my don't read the reviews, is like TikTok stresses me out so much. But I saw a TikTok where someone was like, oh, he took the cauldron of Posey and like created a whole energy system out of it. And it's like, I did not invent that. Like that has been a thing. And like that is a known thing in lots of traditions. And there's scholarship to back up
Mm.
how the cauldron of Posey ties into Plato's concept of the three souls and how that Greek influence moved to Ireland. Plus, it's like poetry in Ireland, like a Feely, I think I'm pronouncing it right. Feely, a poet, is not the same as what we think of. It's not Sylvia Plath. This is a magical, spiritual thing,
Yes.
the poets. So I don't know. It's just one of those, or like one of them. See, I'm venting it all to you right now. Another I saw was like, oh, he's trained so hard not to work with chakras, which I don't really work with chakras, but they're like, oh, but he's doing an alpha where he's going through the rainbow, and so obviously like that's the chakras. And it's like, no, those are the frequencies of light vibration, and that's why they were chosen to be
Mm.
applied to the chakras. But the idea behind what I'm trying to show is going from a slower vibrational state to a higher, faster vibrational state. So I don't know. It's just one of those, like, even when someone has read your work, you'll see exactly what I mean. No.
I feel like, I mean, a month out until it actually releases. Maybe I feel like a lamb slaughter right now, but it's true. Like even just in in some of the comments that I've had, and I've noticed this. I've been like hyper aware of what people are saying of other colleagues' works, especially some of my guests, right? And there is that level of, you know, meeting where they're at, but also them meeting where you're at too. People keep coming back to work. I've noticed that some of the people who have commented on Psychic Witch have come back to it and said and started to speak about that, about how they see it in a different light now. They've come back to it with different eyes. They come back with experience after having gone through the work, and they're appreciating things that they didn't appreciate.
Yeah, and like my work, I tie some very advanced stuff in it without saying it. And on the surface, you know, people are like, oh, you know, like one of the things is like, oh, it's so new age. And I'm like, are you serious? All of what we're doing is technically new age, you know, unless you have with evidence an unbroken chain of your magical practice, you know, like even Thelema, the Golden Dawn, they're considered new age religions, you know. So I don't know, and they have common ancestry too. And a lot of that theosophy, you know, theosophy and hermetics are
Yes.
essentially the Western's parents,
Yeah.
the Western traditions. And a lot of these things that we see as New Age also have influences from those as well. But I'm very much of the school of thought that despite all of that, like I don't care how old something is, I don't care how traditional or untraditional or how new agey or un-new agey it is. My whole thing is, does it work? Like, does it work? Is there merit to it? You know, I much rather focus on that and explore that and teach that than, you know, having this image of, you know, like, oh, I visited the magister at the ye old crossroads, and like, you know, meanwhile they're like, you know, complaining about every aspect of their life, and it's just sort of like, well, why don't you do some magic about it? Like,
oh, I didn't think about that. No, it's true. No, you're right. You're right. It is funny how, again, I think
which I love tradcraft, by the way. I'm just,
no,
you know
no,
who
no,
I'm
no.
talking about
No,
by
it's all
that.
good. No, it's all good. No, no, it's all good. But it speaks more about where that person is coming from than it is what they're actually doing, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, that as a historian myself, that is something that completely blows my mind how few people know that Madame Blavatsky and the Fox sisters and Crowley and all of those 150 years ago now coming up were the origins of a lot of things that, you know, you would find in the New Age section now. But there's no, I feel like the 70s and 80s did a real number on people, because so many people now look back, and even with our own publisher, right? A lot of people look back to that generation of writers as being, oh, they're inventors, they created all sorts of monstrosities and this, that, and, you know, brought it out of their asses and whatnot, right? Without realizing that they were relying on things from the 50s, the 30s, the 1800s, you know?
Who were doing things like combining different schools of thoughts and making things up and experimenting. And, you know, so like at the time, it was literally New Age, you know, it's just that it's been solidified because of what has worked.
Mm-hmm.
And the time that has passed, that some people are starting to not see it as New Age. Like take Thelema, for example. Like I love Thelema, but like literally, like dude was in Egypt. Okay, so already dude was in Egypt. Like a non-physical entity came to him that looked a lot like a gray alien. It wasn't a gray alien, but big egg-headed person was like, you are the prophet of my new religion. Like dictate all this stuff. I'm going to give you all the technology for it. You know, how the hell is channeling a religious book in Egypt not the most new agey thing you've ever heard? Like it's
it's funny, isn't it? Not thinking about it. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah. And then taking that one step further, then looking down on other religions like Mormonism, for example, which, right?
Right. Yeah. And like, for me, it's not a matter of how old something is. Again, it's the merit. I mean, a lot of the theology and philosophy that I love the most is Neoplatonism, so that's like very early Middle Age and late Hellenic period. But for me, that is like the Renaissance of like, oh my God, they've got something. And that's a lot of the ancestry of theosophy and the Golden Dawn as well. Um, but like there's older traditions. I could easily just go over to Hellenic, and that's already older. I I don't know. Like, I mean, like if we're going on age, like why aren't we all like Christians or Jewish or
This is the
you
thing, right?
know, because it's older. It's I don't know.
It's that imperialist Western bias. That's what I've noticed. Imperialist Western bias, because when you go into other cultural zones like Buddhism or Hinduism or whatnot, where the cycles of time, it doesn't matter where you are because everything's degenerating until there's suddenly a renewal, right? There's not that sense of age. I mean, age is a very that appeal to age is a very medieval and ancient Hellenic thing, right? But you don't
Yeah.
just tend to find
Well,
that in.
and I think as Westerners, particularly, I would say one of the reasons Americans out of everyone is the worst, which I think Europe has it to some degree, but not as bad as like Americans, is that we are so disconnected from any form of heritage at all, any sort of um, not nearly as bad as the people we enslaved and like totally stripped them of everything. But like I said, there was a lot of renouncing with coming to America of like who they were and like what their who their ancestors were and stuff of that nature. So um yeah, I think there's this sort of thirst in people to want to find something that is older and that like they can connect with. Because I mean, and we've done it to ourselves, like as a people, between the church and, the great, um, what is the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word, but essentially the colonization of the Americas. We were just so disconnected. Like I think that's part of the like that Christian mindset of coming in and wanting things to be like, oh, this is the old thing, that is
Mm.
the true thing, that gives it gives legitimacy to what I do and what I practice. But I don't know. Yeah. I'm
There's a
rambling
lot.
again.
Well, there's a lot to what you just said. I think there's a lot to what you just said. I think it's like a double-edged sword in some way. On the one hand, at least for the focus of this podcast, this season, the folk, really wanting to reconnect with that Christian heritage, but the Christian heritage that's a container for everything.
Right. Yeah. And like, I think that's also part of, I mean, not completely, but I think that's part of why like Norse and heathen traditions draw white supremacists as well,
Makes sense.
because it's like they want that sort of replacement of the church and that oppressive force in their life, just not under that name. So I know many wonderful non-racist, heathens, that like work with them, but then you see a lot of these like white supremacist heathens, and it's like they've literally just plucked out one of Jesus's eyes, gave him a beard, and like made him like an oppressive, like the America Jesus, but instead he's like Odin, and like Odin is our, yeah, I don't know.
I never understand that, to be honest, because if they actually pick up a book, they'll see also. I mean, Well, that's a whole other conversation, the tangent race.
Yeah.
uh, Interesting. It's interesting, kind of the community is like, you know.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I think people are complex. Different people have different motives and are drawn to different things. And it's probably unfair for me to even speak in general, broad strokes like this. But I mean, like, they're observations,
Mhm.
you know. Um,
True. Well, and again, it's that, you know, who is going to feel insecure about those who is going to be kind of get their back up about those observations, right?
yeah. Yeah. And, like maybe even I'm wrong, and
Mhm.
I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with learning. But um yeah, I see a lot of unworked religious trauma and baggage that is carried over. And I don't think it's like necessarily an unnormal thing or an uncommon thing. Like, I've had to work through my religious baggage, and you know, my even things that I thought I was past.
Mm.
So like I had an article on Patheos many years ago, and it ended up being one of my most popular ones. But it's where I discussed how I was like really trying to connect with like Cernunnos, like the horn deity, right? And it wasn't until I had like a vision where he came to me as the devil, and I
Mm.
had to confront like the Christian devil, and I had to confront, well, what are my views on this? Like, what if he is the Christian devil? Like, what is my relationship with that? And do I still have fears of that I intellectually think that I'm over, but I may not be on a deep psychological level? And my answer was, I don't care. Like, like at this point, I really don't care if it is, this giant trickster that's leading me to damnation. I'm just at that point where I don't care. And that's when a lot of things unlocked for me in terms of
Mm.
relationship with deity, male deities specifically. Um, Especially those that are a bit more atavistic, such as Cernunnos and Pan, and those reference points for the devil.
You find okay, I have 100 questions on that, but this is not appropriate time. We're already going over time. So, but did you find that something was reclaimed or something was just unveiled? Like, what was that experience?
I mean, I think it's both.
Yeah.
So I'm a big Pan boy. I love my Pan, and I have a very personal view of Pan, where I do believe that he is the devil, but I don't
Mm.
think the devil is him.
Mm.
And, you know, because the devil, like Pan, was a model of everything the church was villainizing,
Mm.
sexual freedom and pleasure and enjoyment and indulgence and partying and being happy, things that, the the medieval onwards was like, no. So I could also see, kind of going into more of that like Gemma Gary type, devil of like, I could see spirits like Pan being like, well, fuck it. Like maybe that is our enemy. Like, let's go, guys, kind of thing. So I think that's a mask for sure that I think some spirits have. And that kind of rebellious, antagonistic towards this force that is seen as oppressive, particularly to the land and the people and the things that they embody as a deity.
Mm.
um, but I don't think that's the entirety of what they are, and I don't think that, I mean, I don't need to tell you, but like, I don't know where viewers are, but like, it's different than Satan. The idea of the devil is, I see it a lot more as the folkloric thing. But what I love about like someone like Gemma Gary's work is it kind of blurs those lines of like, him being a little bit more of like the church's adversary too. Um,
It's funny sitting here. You've just unlocked something for me, and I know I posted this on my own Facebook page about how unfair I had been to Gemma Gary's work previously in various iterations of my life, and I sat with it for a very long time because it was just a like. I think at one point I said that her scholarship was sloppy and this, blah, 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 all these horrible things. Right? This was only a few years ago. What it was I was in a period of my life where I was, really teetering beyond the edge of, do I mask and go with the authority, or do I become who I actually am? Go figure, 12 months later, I came out as non-binary. I was suddenly like realizing all these things about myself, all this, right? And it was that appeal to authority, right? That, do I say fuck it and just be who I am?
Yeah.
And I feel like the folk devil has always been a figure that I've never really understood until that point. And at that point, I was like, oh, Dionysus, of course. Oh, Hermes, of course, right? All of these
Well,
trends.
and I also think that, like scholarship is something that people try to sort of hide behind too,
Mm,
as the themes of that what we were talking about. Because there's certain things like um Margaret Murray, right?
mhm,
Like
yeah.
Margaret Murray, we know most likely, and that's being generous, that what she was saying wasn't true. But there is a mythopoetic truth to what she's saying. It's just like if you pick up any of Chumbley's books on sabbatic craft, right? We don't have a lot of evidence that the Sabbat was this astral experience,
Mm,
but there's a truth in it. There's a current to it. So I think even sometimes bad scholarship, or I love the word mythopoetic because it's
mm,
like it acknowledges that like this may not have literally have happened on one level, but it doesn't invalidate that there's a current of energy to this story and to I don't know, the substance. I my brain's starting to shut down with words.
oh, good. No, no, I've kept you for a very long time, and I really appreciate you indulging that. But I agree. A lot of my work tends to be within that realm of possibility, right? People, I think, again, that baggage come from a place of, is this true or is this false? And it's the wrong question. It's the wrong yardstick to measure any of this by,
Right.
right? But I think there's also danger in that of going too psychological with it. And you know what I mean by that.
Yes, and too dangerous of like adamantly wanting to believe false history. I am so appreciative of scholarship, like Hutton, like we were saying, like I really love I'm gonna butcher his name, Claude Lecourtois,
Oh, yes, yes,
and,
yes.
and all of his work. I think I own every book he's ever written. Emma Wilby, like I love the scholarship on it, but it's not the most important thing to me
Exactly.
when it comes to the craft, and it doesn't define my craft. It lets me know how to speak about things, in
Mhm.
terms of what is historical and what is ahistorical. But just because something's ahistorical doesn't mean there wasn't something to it. Most
Mhm.
religions that view their version of history is not probably
Mhm.
not that historical, but it teaches something. There's something in there. It serves a purpose. It's mythopoetic.
It's mythopoetic, exactly. Another example could be Marita Gimbutas's work, right? She was the scholar who looked at the Yamnaya culture in Eastern Europe, right? And by the looks of it, from her perspective, it was a very matriarchal culture. Of course, that was taken up in the 70s with all sorts of vitriol of how dare you, you can't say that, blah, blah, and then taken in a different way. So the lenses that people view these stories tells us more about ourselves than necessarily the actual thing we're viewing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think another thing that I think people struggle with is because of Christianity, we have been taught literalism. and literalism as our starting point, to the point of fundamentalism. So like even when, you have theosophist and like pre-theosophist and like kind of like right after theosophy, like talking about concepts like Atlantis and stuff like that, like they're not talking about a literal physical place that existed like rocks. They're talking about like an etheric, for lack of a better word, an etheric astral thing that they believe occurred on the planet. And like whether that's true or not, who knows? But I think the idea of trying to make things fit too neatly into history as well as science, and I acknowledge and appreciate both of those, it defeats the bigger point of what we're doing to begin with and the realms that we're working with, which are very, very subjective. There's objective qualities to it, but again, it's all about relationship and the personal mind and spirit of a person.
I love that. And I think that's a good place to end that idea of relationship. Yeah. Matt, this has been absolutely wonderful. I was quite nervous meeting with you today because we've only ever encountered each other online. So this was wonderful, though. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, it's been fun. I enjoyed speaking to you, and geeking out and rambling about
Geeking
stuff.
out and rambling, it's wonderful. Before we go though, so I think this is coming out in October. It's kind of timey-wimey when things are coming out, but is there anything that you want to plug coming up into the new year, or anything that you've got offered?
So the only thing I can think of that will still be relevant by the time this comes out is Pisces Witch should be coming out. It's part of Ivo Dominguez Jr.'s Zodiac Witch series from Llewellyn. I was honored to co-write it, and Ivo is like my biggest hero. He's who I always say I want to be when I grow up. And it started as half joke, and like as time goes on, it's less of a joke, especially as you get to know Ivo and how freaking brilliant and amazing he is. So I'm super excited about that. I will also, it'll probably be announced by this time. Both Devin and I are going to be guest speakers at Convocation in February. So check that out. That'll be
And
exciting.
Convocation, for those who don't know, is in Michigan, in Detroit, right?
Yes, I believe it's in Detroit. It is in Michigan. I know that. I've never gone, so it's my first time. So
excellent. I know some people from Southern Ontario who go regularly, and it always sounds amazing, right? But I hope I hope you have a wonderful time with it. That we'll hear more about it on Facebook. For those who are interested in Pisces Witch, of course, we've also had people like Madame Pamita on, and a couple of the other writers who've been. I loved her. She was hilarious.
She's one of my favorite people. She's my buddy.
Well, she's just like down south from you, isn't she? She's like what?
Yeah, I mean, she's still like a bit of a drive. Like we don't see each other casually, but like we chat all the time, and then we constantly see each other because we run the same circles, both in witchcraft and then like kind of the psychic tarot divination type side of the world. So like we're always at the same things, and she's one of my favorite people.
She was fun. She was really fun to interview. I will put the link down to Pisces Witch down below, and link to all of Matt's other social media stuff. And go and check him out if you don't know who he is. I'm sure most people viewing this will know, but if you don't, go and check him out. And Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.